Robots Radio presents...
Hey everybody, welcome into the podcast. We are back with another special bonus episode. Today we are reviving our My Favorite Movie series. We are here in studio with Paul Hletko, who is joining us from just outside Chicago, Illinois. He is the founder and CEO of Few Spirits. They are based in Evanston, Illinois. Paul, how are you today?
Doing great. Thanks for having me on, guys.
Absolutely. Now, this is actually the second time in just a matter of weeks that we've had Few on the podcast. We did an interview with a guy named Josh Larson a couple weeks ago, who's a film critic in the Chicago area. And one of our Instagram friends from Chicago said, hey, I think you should just make this an all Chicago episode. I've got a couple bottles of this Few bourbon. Let me send some to you. And so we were actually able to feature Few on the podcast then. And today we're going to go ahead and try the Few Rye. So we're just going to make a whole thing out of it.
Awesome.
Yeah, if you guys weren't able to hear that interview with Josh Larson, get back and listen to that. We want you to hear about Few Bourbon, and we're really excited to talk about Few Rye today.
So, Paul, we got a couple introductory questions here before we get into your movie, and I'm super excited to talk about your favorite movie. But I was wondering if you could just break down for our listeners a little bit of the history of Few Spirits, because I think just as important as the company's history is the location and where you're situated and how Evanston kind of plays into the mythology of Few Spirits.
Yes, I mean, Few is, we're a small distillery. Been for sale now about 8.5 years. I've been lucky enough to be able to have some growth, and we're located in Evanston, Illinois. And the interesting thing about being in Evanston, aside from the fact that it's where I live and we're, raise my kids and such, the actual thing that's interesting about Evanston is that it's the birthplace of Prohibition. And the women that drove Prohibition forward as a national concept lived here. And so Evanston has always been a dry town. And basically, long story short, TLDR, I'm the guy that killed Prohibition in its home.
Attaboy, Paul.
Well, I mean, I think it's actually a lot more complicated. If anything, I think it's a little bit of a tip of the hat.
Yeah, for sure.
In order to judge history, you kind of have to put yourself in the shoes of the people that were living it. And the women that were driving Prohibition forward in the late 1800s, quite honestly, didn't really have a choice. And I tend to have the attitude that Prohibition is what happens when people can't have nice things. And in the late 1800s, people couldn't have nice things like alcohol in the same way that it seems today people can't have nice things like, guns.
Sure.
Everything's good until it's until people can't handle it. And, in the late 1800s, people couldn't handle their alcohol.
So, Paul, walk me through a little bit of the process of starting up Few. I'm really impressed by your growth. Your website says it. You guys have basically doubled in growth every year since you've started. You're on 5 continents now. But I've read a few interviews about the history of the company and what your inspiration was. And I just think it's such a great story.
Well, I mean, I've got a little bit of family history with alcohol. And, prior to World War II, my grandfather's family owned what's now a major brewery in the Czech Republic. And you and I presume most of your listeners know what happened in 1939. But the Nazis invaded, the Czech Republic in 1939 and confiscated the brewery, murdered the entire family in the camps, with only my grandfather surviving. And, when he kind of survived the war, I spent the rest of his life trying to get the brewery back, but never did. And when he died, it kind of struck me that all this family legacy is gone forever, if I don't do something about it. And so Few is kind of trying to do something about it. We take it pretty seriously. It's definitely a business. It's certainly an art. And, we spend all of our day every day trying to put liquid art in bottle. But for me, it's also a little bit of blood, a little bit of history, a little bit of family. And it's something I kind of hold pretty close to my heart.
Yeah.
Not just my liver.
Yeah, Paul, it's amazing how important family ties and connections are and how they really give a deeper meaning to the work that you do. And I love the way you put it, that you're putting liquid art in the bottle. I mean, that's just amazing.
We like to be artists. And yes, it's commerce. And, this is a business. This is how I feed my children, including a teenage son. So that ain't easy.
Right.
But it's all about the art and that creativity and that ability to hopefully inspire somebody out there to be the best them that they can be. Alcohol is something that really, I think, brings people together, brings friends together, brings families together. And, in many ways, kind of like movies, right? You watch movies with your friends, you watch movies with your family, you enjoy it. You bust on your friends with movie lines and what have you. And, these are the things that are kind of the fabric of our social lives. And alcohol can be that as well, at least in the best of worlds.
Man, Paul, we're just going to take that clip and use that as our, introduction to the Film and Whiskey podcast. Because we so often talk about, like, what do you do when you hang out with your friends? You watch movies and you drink alcohol. And, we here at the Film and Whiskey podcast love whiskey. But, man, what better way to describe what we're trying to do here on the podcast?
No, you bring people together. Movies do that. Music does that. Alcohol does that. Food does that. It's the companion to your life, whether it's, you guys are into movies, other guys are into music. Some people are maybe into opera, or some people are into visual arts. It's not, I would never say that one's better or worse than the other ones, but these are all the things that are the soundtrack or the companion to your life. And it's just magic what these things can do for the quality of life. And, we're pretty honored that what we do gets to be a part of that.
Well, speaking of what you do, Paul, I'm just kind of blown away by the lineup that you guys have there at Few Spirits. We were talking with Josh Larson, our interview guest a few weeks ago, and his exposure to Few had been that he tried your breakfast gin. And so he spent like a good portion of our whiskey podcast talking about how good the breakfast gin was. So I knew I had to at least mention to you that we've got film and whiskey listeners that are also advocating for Few gin. So
fantastic.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind just kind of giving us a rundown of what it is that you produce at the distillery, and maybe tip your cap a little bit to which one might be your favorite child.
So, at the distillery, what we produce is probably about 95, 98% whiskey, mostly bourbon and rye. Those are our horses. That's what we kind of specialize in. It's our focus. And that's great. We love bourbon. We love rye, and it's awesome. Gin is something we make because it's just incredibly fun to make gin. You can make gin quickly. You can iterate. You can have all these different recipes. And there's almost no rules to gin. And for a guy like me who has quite frankly, an intense hatred of anything authority, the fact there's no rules for gin is fantastic. So we can be super crazy, super fun. We can break rules that don't even exist. We can do crazy, wild, stupid stuff because it's fun. And, case in point of that is going to be your breakfast gin. It's the only breakfast gin on the market. We own the name breakfast gin, so there's not going to be another one.
Wow.
But, your breakfast gin, it's the most important gin of the day. At least that's what my mama taught me. A couple of years ago, everybody was drinking their shower beers, and that was great. But, it's almost 2020, guys. It's time to up your shower game.
Yeah.
And, it's a shower martini year. As far as
I was going to say, if you make a breakfast vermouth to go with it, then it's just the classiest shower of all time.
As long as you say the word vermouth while you're looking towards France, you're okay.
Okay.
My real question is, do you have to drink the breakfast gin with your pinky up?
You don't. And again, there's a lot of people that think you can only drink gin for breakfast, but that's just simply not true anymore. This is not orange juice here, guys. This is gin. You can drink it any time of day. If you like drinking your gin for pinky up, then I would strongly suggest you drink your breakfast gin for pinky up. That's not my style, but far be it from me to judge anybody for drinking how they like to drink.
Well, we think it's always a good time to drink whiskey, and Brad and I have poured out the Few Rye. Brad, before we get into kind of giving our notes on it, I was wondering if Paul could kind of walk us through what goes into your rye. I don't know if you guys are super secretive about your mash bill, but anything that you'd like to share with us about the rye, we'd love for our listeners to hear.
Sure. We're not super secretive about much. I just don't have the time. But
I like this guy's style, Brad.
Yeah, our mash bill, it's 70% rye, 20% corn, 10% malted barley, which is a pretty unique mash bill. When we came out, we're not aware of anybody that was using it. After we kind of launched ours and it started getting all the press and winning all the awards, a small distillery down in Lynchburg, Tennessee copied it, and they started producing rye with that mash bill. But I don't think anybody's ever heard of that distillery. So
No, super small distillery. Right.
But yeah, 70-20-10 bourbon, rye corn malt, sorry. And the other interesting thing about it as far as the ingredients is the yeast that we use. And we use a red wine yeast that's popular in the Loire Valley in France.
Wow.
And so, our kind of quick breakdown on the rye whiskey is generally going to be that you get a lot of spice from the rye grain. You get a little bit of sweet from that corn backing it up. And you get a little bit of subtle stone fruit and kind of jammy notes kind of in the mid to the finish from that yeast.
Yeah, Brad, on the nose of this rye, first of all, I have to say I've tried this rye 3 times now before we've even recorded the podcast because I just couldn't wait. And our listeners know that of all of the varieties of whiskey, rye is probably my least favorite whiskey. And this rye has every single time just knocked my socks off. Like, it's not harsh at all on the nose. It's really pleasant. It's very floral. And the word that kept coming to mind for me is bright. I got quite a few hints of herbs. It's a little earthy. There's some mint going on in there. But just like Paul said, that addition of the corn, you do get some of that classic bourbon-y sweetness and caramel notes that come off of it as well. Brad, what are you picking up on the nose of this?
Honestly, I'm picking up a lot of that brightness that you're talking about, Bob. I think that the spiciness I'm smelling, it almost has this kind of cinnamony type of smell to it that I'm really enjoying the aroma.
Well, why don't we go ahead and take a sip? Cheers to you, Paul.
Cheers, boys.
Oh, man, that is just darn good.
It almost has like a honey type flavor on the finish. It's like a little bit buttery. I mean, this is an impressive rye.
It's sweet. For me, it was sweet up front on the very tip of my tongue. And the spices kind of develop throughout the tasting. The finish is lasting, but again, this is a really, I don't want to use the word subtle because I think that undersells what this rye is doing. But nothing in this rye overpowers you. And I think one of the things that I've always disliked about rye is how easily you could make a really harsh and bitter rye. But it has this really delicate balance of floral notes, of herbal notes, and then that classic sweetness and that great rye spice. It's just a perfectly balanced rye whiskey.
Certainly balances what we're looking for. I think there's a decent number of ryes that are perhaps a little focused on one part of the flavor spectrum. And so we try really hard to make sure that we're balancing properly and, having that complete whiskey with spice and with sweet and with a little bit of fruit. There's no smoke on this one. We love smoke, but there just isn't any here. But I think balance is really the key to a great whiskey because you have to have a true depth of flavor.
Yeah, Paul, and if you wanted to do a little education for our listeners, how do you pull out those different flavors, those bright fruity notes, but also those spicy notes? How do you pull those out in the distilling process?
I think there's a whole bunch of different tools you have to create flavors in the distilling process, ranging from what grains you're using, what strains of grain you're using, the yeast that you use. But it even goes beyond that because once you start in your production, there's a whole bunch of stuff you can do to bring out or suppress different flavors, ranging from fermentation temperatures to fermentation time, what kind of fermentation you're doing, what kind of fermentation vessel it is, what distillation techniques you use, what kind of barrels you use. There's everything we do affects the flavor, and so there's really more that we do to bring out those flavors than you could even say in a short period of time. At the end, long story short, we do an awful lot, and we really focus on creating that flavor.
Well, before we move into the next segment of our podcast, I do want to ask you about your background. Paul, you were a lawyer by trade, and I'm wondering how that background kind of set you up for success in the distilling world. Did you find that you were kind of immediately able to put your talents to use in that realm, or was it kind of like you had to step out of the lawyer mindset to become the distiller?
I think it's a little bit of everything. And, certainly you're not going to find a lot of lawyers that are willingly going to pass by a bar, if you know what I'm saying. and certainly I'm no exception to that. But I think, really the key of being a really good lawyer is that ability to create, a version of the future that you want. And, you try to protect your clients by making the future that they want. And being a distiller or being your own boss or being your own, being an entrepreneur is pretty much the same thing. You're just creating the future that you want based on what you do. And so you kind of have to see what you want, and then you work backwards from there to create those conditions for that to happen. No different than being like a podcast host or being a plumber or an electrician. Certainly being a lawyer is helpful, but the amount of work I've had to pay for from plumbers, I'd rather have been a plumber.
One of the things, Paul, that I'm really kind of floored by that you've also found time to do somehow is that you served as the president and you're still on the board of the American Craft Spirits Association. So I'm wondering if you could just briefly tell us a little bit about that, and then also kind of how your background in law sets you up with that as well, because there's a lot of policy making involved from what I understand about that organization.
Yeah, I mean, the ACSA is something I hold really near and dear to my heart. And when we started up as a distillery, it was extremely difficult because there was, almost nobody ahead of us to give us a hand. And what I found is that, while there weren't a whole lot of people out there, the people that were there would, cross the street and climb a tree to give you a hand. So, I owe an awful lot of my success or whatever I'm doing right now to these dear friends of mine at this point. But these are people that, like I said, walked across the street and climbed a tree to give me a hand, and they had no obligation to do so.
Yeah.
And so I've tried to give back a little bit too. And so we're a founding member of the American Craft Spirits Association. And what that is just kind of really working with the distillers all over the country to make all of us better. Whether that is on education or policy, throwing a good party once a year. It's really about all of us getting together and making us each better with, education, friendly rivalry, all of that. And so, as a founding member, because I saw the need for such an organization, I was one of the first board members because I actually got elected as a board member. 2 years later, I was the president of the organization. And now I'm still, technically I'm on the board, even though I don't have a vote anymore because I'm just ex officio, because that's the whole point of having a membership organization is that everybody gets to vote, not just me. And so it's all of us together. And I think it's really something that's one of the greatest things I've done is try to really help put together all of us little guys and make us all better. And you can see it getting better every day.
Well, Paul, we are just so impressed with everything that you've been doing. I mean, from what you've done with the distillery to your background. And, I sent you an email the other day and was really excited to hear what this learned man of law would choose for his film, which one we're going to dissect on this podcast. So why don't you share with our listeners what movie we're going to be talking about today?
Well, I was trying to watch it, but I got lost, backstage in a stadium in Cleveland. So I kind of forgot what movie it's all about. But I'm thinking it's not going to get much blacker than this one. But yeah, I had to go ahead and pick Spinal Tap.
This is Spinal Tap. That's right.
The greatest movie of all time.
The 1984,
one of my favorites.
The 1984 mockumentary by Rob Reiner. This is a classic of the comedy genre. Now, Paul, I don't know how familiar you are with our podcast, but the whole conceit behind our podcast is that I grew up a huge movie nerd, and Brad is my best friend and has not seen a lot of these movies. So every week I ask Brad, have you seen this film? And so I have to ask you, Brad, have you seen This is Spinal Tap?
Not only have I never seen it, I honestly had never heard of it before you told me that this is the movie we'd be talking about today.
Oh, man. This is Spinal Tap is a movie that's made in the style of a documentary about a rock band that's kind of, over the hill a little bit. And this documentary filmmaker is following them around on their tour and all of the mishaps and misadventures that happen on this rock tour. It is just, Paul, how would you describe it? What was your reaction to it when you first saw it?
Well, when I first saw it, I was a young teenager, shall we say, and rather into heavy metal, and I just thought it was absolutely hilarious because there's all these guys, and there's they're all playing it totally straight, of course, and they're dead earnest, but they're just dumb as posts. And it's just hilarious, ranging, with it's so deadpan. I think for whatever reason, it really kind of struck me that all these straight guys doing this just inane stuff, it's funny.
Yeah, and it really set all of these guys up for their future. I mean, Rob Reiner obviously had a history on TV and in film, but this is the first time you get that sort of Christopher Guest and Michael McKean pairing that they would go on to do time and time again in the same sort of style that they did in Spinal Tap. But I don't know if it's ever been done better than this.
They've done some really great ones. I mean, certainly Best in Show was fantastic, and you could go back and forth in other ones, but there was something about it that really just kind of, at least for me, captured that kind of ennui and that, that kind of time and place. You can kind of go back and you can see an awful lot of movies that were filmed around that same time, and they get, shall I say, a little dated perhaps. But I think this one it continues to live, and, the cultural references that you get out of it, remain live. And you still think, you can still see things, jokes made about, but this one goes to 11, or none more black, or
Hello, Cleveland.
I had a friend of mine just ordered a chair for their living room online, and it got delivered, and it was a small little dollhouse chair. And so, of course, I had to respond with a video of Stonehenge coming down on stage with, these things are real. This is real life, and it's silly, and it's stupid, and it's funny, and you're going to kick over the 22-inch model of Stonehenge.
I think he says it was in danger of being crushed by a dwarf.
Yes.
So, Paul, one of the things that I really impresses me about this movie, I went back and watched quite a few clips from it in preparation for this. I get to say preparation as if I wasn't just enjoying the heck out of it. One thing that really blows me away is how much contemporary comedy has borrowed from this style of movie making. Like, if you're a fan of The Office or Parks and Rec or Brooklyn Nine-Nine or any of those shows that are made in this sort of mockumentary style, it all comes directly from Spinal Tap.
Drunk History. I don't know if you've seen Drunk History, which you should. If not,
oh yeah,
it's awesome. Documentary now on Netflix. These are all, at least to my limited knowledge, I think Spinal Tap kind of invented in many ways the mockumentary style. I'm sure I'm wrong on that, but I'll stick to it.
Hey man, you gave us free whiskey, so we're just going to agree with whatever you say.
That's right.
To me, it's just classic.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget. My dad. I had on VHS, of course, because I'm that old. And my dad would actually watched it, and he didn't realize that it was a joke. So I got sat down at the kitchen table and lectured about my heroes. And these may not be really role models, and they're worried about the direction of life I might be taking. I'm like, it's a joke, Dad.
Don't worry, Dad. I'll become a lawyer someday, and then I'll start making alcohol.
I actually did get an apology from my parents at one point a couple years ago, saying that if they had known what I was going to do with alcohol, they would have encouraged it.
Now all you need to do is get an apology about Spinal Tap, and you'll be good.
Well, I think we're even. I was in Playboy a couple of years ago. My mom had to buy a copy of Playboy to read the article. It doesn't get better than that, boys.
No. So, Paul, if you had to pinpoint like one specific scene that you could just watch on repeat forever, what would be your one key scene from this movie?
Probably either This Goes to 11. I also love the scene where he's talking about the little piano piece he wrote. That's a little bit of Mozart, a little bit of Bach. Maybe it's a bit of a mock piece. Lines intertwining with lines, and then he says the name of the song is "Lick My Love Pump."
Yeah.
That's how can you not laugh at "Lick My Love Pump"?
That's my favorite scene in the whole movie.
D minor is the saddest of keys, really.
I feel like I don't really need to see the movie. I just need to hear you guys deliver these one lines and just be like, wow, this must be a heck of a movie.
That's the thing about great comedies, though, is like, you have an Anchorman, or you have an Airplane, or a Caddyshack, and these movies have entered into the public consciousness so much that you just drop a line like, "It goes to 11," and there's just this immediate recognition. I think comedies can get to this place in society where, the big dramatic movies just can't reach.
Yep. Like I can tell my kids, Shirley, you must be joking, and they'll respond.
Yeah.
I'm not joking, and don't call me Shirley.
Right. So, Paul, as we kind of close out today, first of all, we want to say thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Thank you for the rye. Anytime you want to come back, when there's a bottle of whiskey showing up at our house and it says "few" on the front of it, we know that we are in for something fantastic at this point. And so I just want
plenty of whiskey.
Hey, we've got plenty of stomach space.
That's right.
Is there anything coming up at the distillery or any releases that you guys are preparing for that you'd like to just get a plug in for?
Sure. We got 2 releases that we're kind of really excited about right now. One of them we're calling Cold Cut, and it's our bourbon whiskey brought to bottle strength with cold brew coffee. We're super excited about that. It's delicious. It's fun. It's new. It's different. And the second one is a rock band collaboration we did.
With Spinal Tap?
Not with Spinal Tap, although perhaps not all that different. Alice in Chains.
Oh, awesome.
Oh, wow.
So my guess is there's some similarities there. But we worked with the Flaming Lips a couple of years ago, and I can guarantee you there's some similarities there. But working with Alice in Chains is, certainly fantastic. I'm a huge fan, and, certainly on that kind of heavy metal / grunge tip.
Well, as somebody who helps run a coffee shop, I am extremely intrigued by the cold cut that you were talking about.
Oh, it's fantastic stuff. We've done probably 5 or 6 different coffee-related iterations over the last couple of years, trying to find the right mix of coffee and booze. And we've done some cool stuff in the past and this and that. But this, we think we're really onto something with this one because it's the best we've done. It should be hitting the market right around December 1st, I think. And we're real excited. It's already out a little bit in Chicagoland, with wider distribution coming for sure.
We cannot wait to get our hands on a bottle of that cold cut. Anytime you are in the Chicago area, if you feel like shooting just a little bit up the road to Evanston, please go check out Few Spirits and their distillery. We cannot thank Paul Hletko enough for joining us today. For the Film and Whiskey Podcast, I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And that has been Paul Hletko. We'll see you guys next time.